This video is the third in a three-part book review series on Tim Urban's book, What's Our Problem? And this video is actually going to probably come across like I hated the book, which is not at all the case. I absolutely loved the first third of the book. And the last third rubbed me the wrong way, and that's what this video is about. But please watch my other two videos for sort of my fangirl version of this book review, because I really did think he's sort of making progress on some of these really important societal problems. So what rubbed me the wrong way about the last third? And I think the quickest way of saying this is that the last third felt very tribal to me. And in particular, it felt like the anti-woke tribe, just speaking the usual stuff from the anti-woke tribe. And I want to be clear that I'm not anti-woke. Like, I organize a Heterodox Academy group of faculty. So this is a group of people that I spend a lot of time with. And to be clear, the Heterodox Academy is diverse. There are lots of different perspectives represented, but it leans a little bit anti-woke. So while I do not identify as anti-woke, I enjoy spending time with people who are a little bit more in that tribe than I am. I think they oftentimes do a great job of creating spaces that are open to exploration of different viewpoints. I love that about them. And I also want to say I'm very much pro-liberal democracy values, like the values of the scientific method, human rights, due process, consent of the governed. Those values, I think, are so essential. And this whole channel really is about what can we do to update our current system to make sure that we're upholding those good values in a world where we have technology going crazy and some entrenchment in the system. Like, how do we update our system in favor of liberal values? That's what I'm all about. And I think a large part of his, I'm going to call it an anti-woke diatribe, is him arguing in favor of liberal values, that liberal values need to be placed above social justice. And I would say I generally agree with that. I generally agree that we're not going to have social justice in the long run if we don't have a really, really solid foundation of liberal democratic values. So I agree with him on a lot. And in a lot of ways, my negative reaction, I think, comes from the fact that I think some of this stuff is so important, and some of the things he's trying to say, I think, are so important, that him flubbing it up with this anti-woke diatribe just pissed me off. Let me get into my actual arguments against his approach. And I'd first like to defend my claim that anti-woke is a tribe. So how do I define a tribe in the modern tribal sense? And the way I would define this is that tribes of people are people who share similar values. In the online space, they consume similar content with similar biases. And even if they are on average consuming a variety of content, their elephant, like their natural gut reaction, tends in a certain direction, where they tend to like certain types of arguments and dislike other types of arguments. And they may try to overcome their elephant's gut reaction, but tribes group together in the kind of content that they favor or disfavor. And therefore, tribes have blind spots. They have spots where they're not able to fully hear certain arguments against their tribe's favorite positions. That's how I would define a tribe. And tribes are not just the left and the right. Sometimes it's easy and it's simple to just describe them that way, and I sometimes describe them that way. But I think there are a lot of sub-tribes under left and right, some of which don't actually have all that much in common. And then there's some tribes that actually span both left and right. And one flaw of those tribes is that they can sometimes view themselves as being more neutral and less tribe-like, even though they're just a tribe that happens to pull some from the right and some from the left. So I stand by my claim that anti-woke is a tribe. Now let me get into some specific critiques I have of his approach. And the first one is name-calling. He obviously does need a way of referring to what some people would call the woke. And he acknowledges that woke has become pejorative. It's become derogatory. So he decides to use a different term. And the term he uses is social justice fundamentalist. And of course, this isn't social justice warrior, the SJWs, because that was like the derogatory term that was used in like 2017, 2018. And he recognizes that was derogatory. But I would actually say social justice fundamentalist is actually maybe even more derogatory than either of those things. Like, people who are in the circles that I think he's trying to convince definitely have a really negative reaction to fundamentalist. It means they're not open to new argument. It means they're stuck in their positions. It has all these negative associations. And I think those negative associations are not at all fair when considering a lot of people that he might consider woke, or that are very much advocating for social justice, even above liberal values. So I think the name calling really bothered me. Now, at this point, you might ask me to define these groups, or like, what do I think people generally mean when they say woke? And some people will say that woke has a religious nature to it, that people are stuck in their positions, that they're as resistant to arguments against what people for their cause are doing as people who are fundamentalists in churches. And on one hand, I think there's something that's somewhat accurate about that, in the sense that I think people who are often classified as woke, that I would actually just call like social justice advocates, maybe would be a less derogatory term. I think many of them do want a formation aspect of what they're doing. Like, they want to be deeply embedded enough in the cause of social justice that on an emotional level, on a reactive level, they're attuned to problems related to social justice. And that involves sort of emotional formation, or what some people might even call spiritual formation. And I think they're trying their best to take on that spiritual formation in a way that I don't have a problem with. Now, if they impose it on other people, I don't think spiritual formation generally works well when you impose it from the outside. And I generally would apply democratic principles where consent of the governed is something you would want generally. But that's a whole nother issue. So I think just because they're trying to form themselves spiritually in a certain way, that's not necessarily bad. And sometimes to form yourself in certain emotional reactions, a strategy might be to cut off arguments that are against what you're trying to do in forming yourself. And let me give an example here with religion. One thing that some religions do is that you look at your own character flaws and you try to recognize, where could I grow as a person? And you build emotional ways for yourself to sort of move into that growth. So if like you're trying not to gossip because you have a tendency to gossip about people, you might move into a spiritual formation phase where any argument that some gossip is okay, you're like, I'm not giving in to that kind of argument, even if it has validity, because the direction I'm trying to grow is toward gossiping less. Like, I've identified that as some area that I should work on, and I'm using spiritual formation processes to move into that. And I think that's somewhat analogous to the way some people who are social justice advocates view their anti-racism formation processes. Now, my second critique of his anti-woke diatribe is the hackneyed examples that he pulls from. Like, when I read this, I was like, I'm aware of all of these examples, and so hearing them again, hearing them framed in the same language that was used when I first heard them, that's not going to sway me. No, I think some of these are actually good examples, and some of them did sway me a little bit in one direction or another when I first heard them. But the fact that he's returning examples from like 4 years ago or 5 years ago, for one, I think that's bad rhetoric. But I also think it's it's not living into some of the things he points out in the early part of the book that I liked. And one of those was he recognized that in these culture wars, both sides come up with examples, and examples that support their side, they'll view those as trends or patterns, or almost as an escalation of a problem in the world. And examples from the other side, they'll view as cherry-picked examples. And one of the reasons the sides cannot understand each other is that they frame examples in this way. So I think that's absolutely true. I think it's a really deep thing that's going on that deserves more discussion, and I will probably do another video on that. But I think the problem here with this section of the book is that he doesn't get around that problem. Like he says he's really careful with these examples, but being careful will not actually overcome this perception problem. We actually need some techniques and tools, whether they're technological tools or intellectual tools or whatever, to overcome this problem. And he has not presented any such tools. And you might imagine somebody who's on the opposite side of him, someone in the social justice advocate camp, they could probably come up with a book with examples that are just as compelling from their side. And them being careful with those examples is not sufficient on that side either. So I think the fact that he's trying to use all of these hackneyed examples, despite the fact that he's acknowledged this problem, it's not good rhetoric. It's not good rhetoric at all. And as a matter of fact, I think one thing that goes wrong when people talk across difference, so often when the other side hears those examples, it's as a way of saying your side doesn't matter. Like someone who's a social justice advocate is going to say, I've heard those examples, and everyone who uses those examples is trying to just say social justice doesn't matter. Essentially, they're saying, don't worry about social justice. Here's a bunch of examples for why you shouldn't worry about this. And I don't think that's exactly the way the examples are being used, but that is the way they're experienced. And sometimes those examples are sort of ways of dismissing the good arguments on the social justice advocate side. And this is one of my big issues, is the dismissiveness. I think we have all of these thought patterns that allow us to dismiss arguments from the other side and dismiss even having to hear someone who thinks differently than ourselves. And it's those patterns of dismissal that are the big problem. And I don't think he recognizes that these examples are in that camp. They're ways of dismissing. Now, my next critique here is in a similar vein, which is that a lot of the examples he comes up with are examples where somebody who's advocating for social justice does something kind of capricious and is doing it probably for the wrong reasons, just to exert their power. And it's just like a really bad example of abandoning, liberal values and abandoning due process and all of that. And my guess is a lot of people who are very much social justice advocates would look at those examples and say, that's not the norm. That's not what most people who are in my group would do. That's just like the worst case scenarios and the worst advocates for our own cause. And I think people who are in all kinds of camps get really frustrated when they are judged by the worst examples from their group. And some people will call this nut picking, where you pick the worst cases of people who are advocating for that cause. You point to them and you're like, if you go too far in that direction you're thinking about, you're going to end up doing what they did. And it's like, no. And that's just a general frustration for not just social justice advocates, but I think people in a lot of groups. The fact that we can be judged by the worst people in our group, it leads causes to not be able to take momentum. That's just a general problem that we need to solve, or no cause, however just, however good and fair and righteous, will ever take hold, because that cause will be held back by the worst actors. My fourth critique here is that I think he has a really weak argument against the strongest argument I can think of in the social justice advocate cause. So to go back to the reframing here, if we have these two values, social justice and liberal values, those two things, there's different hierarchies we could have here. One is that social justice should be the highest cause. Another is that liberal values should be the highest cause. And you can't really have them be equal because there could be moments when when you have to choose between the two causes. But my guess is most social justice advocates generally like liberal values, they like liberal democracy, and they'll support liberal values except when it conflicts with that cause. And the reverse is true for people advocating for liberal values, that they may very much be in favor of social justice, but not when it conflicts with liberal values. And I think that last one, that liberal values need to reign supreme, they need to be the sort of basis of what we're doing, and then social justice is built on top of that. That's his position. That's also my personal position. But the best argument from the social justice advocates, I think, is that we've tried the liberal values thing and things were not going in the right direction. Like, it didn't work. It wasn't leading toward more social justice. It was leading to power to the powerful. It was leading power to get entrenched and marginalized groups to get forgotten in the policy order, all of that stuff. That's a pretty decent argument. And he doesn't give a good enough response to it. He mentions, of course, Hans Rosling and Steven Pinker. And with those two authors, and here I'm talking about Steven Pinker and his books, Better Angels of Our Nature and Enlightenment Now, and Hans Rosling and his book, Factfulness. The basic thesis is that things are getting better and better over time, and you don't want to disrupt things too much because if you disrupt things, you could lose some of the progress that we have gained over the years. And Better Angels of Our Nature, it's a long book, but very worth it. And it basically argues that there's been less and less violence over time. And then these other books look at sort of poverty rates and education rates among low-income people and how those continue to get better and better over time. And of course, my response here is there's going to be some things that are definitely getting better and better over time, and we want to make sure not to disrupt that process of taking people out of poverty and educating a greater share of the population, all of that. We don't want to disrupt that. But there are some things that are getting worse and worse, and this includes things like inequality. It includes things like depreciation of institutions that uphold liberal democracy, which may include the legal system or the criminal justice system or academia or whatnot. There is some depreciation in those areas, perhaps. Power to the powerful is actually a thing, and inequality is rising. People who have power are starting to control access to power. And you can see that through admission to colleges, where the top colleges are admitting more and more people from the top 1% and fewer people from the middle class. Like, that's a trend. And we want to make sure we're fixing the areas of the system that have negative trends without hurting the positive trends going on. So the argument should not be about which one of these to focus on, the good or the bad. It should be about how can we collectively improve the bad or change the direction of the bad without harming the good. And I think that's possible. It's possible to do both of those things at the same time. Treating it like it's a zero sum between things are getting better and things are getting worse is absolutely the wrong way to approach this. So I think he's too dismissive of the argument that it didn't work when we were basing our whole society on liberal values. And then my last critique here is that when he takes up this anti-woke dialogue, it turns into a little bit of an us versus them sort of thing. Like, the anti-woke are correct, the woke are misguided, the woke have too much power. And I think that's misguided because a lot of these arguments that disintegrate into us versus them, they're really about which thing is more important. And it's this sort of zero-sum game about one has to be more important than the other. And I actually do believe you do have to prioritize in different settings. But if you break this whole debate that seems like it's this entrenched debate between the woke and the anti-woke, if you break that down into a bunch of sub-questions, my guess is the people would sort themselves differently on different sub-questions. And those sub-questions that people pass in and out of, that's a much more constructive way of approaching this problem. And for example, here are some of the relevant sub-questions. Can you get to social justice without protecting liberal values? That's a big question. Was it liberal values that were failing us in terms of our movement towards social justice? Or was it something else in the system that could be overcome in a way that didn't overtake liberal values? Can social movements succeed without breaking a few eggs, without the use of power in some way, and perhaps without the use of violating liberal principles? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that. Like when I look at really powerful social movements, like the civil rights movement, I think usually what happens is there's sort of two factions within that movement, where one faction is the move fast and break things faction, and the other faction is the grounded, principled faction. And I think of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X as sort of versions of this, where the civil rights movement had Malcolm X to make sure that people couldn't just ignore this problem, that it couldn't just fall to the bottom of the priority list. Like, this problem will be in your face day after day after day, no matter what, based on Malcolm X's approach. But there was also the Martin Luther King, which was the principled, grounded approach. And a lot of people who might look at Malcolm X and say, I can't get on board with that, they could look at Martin Luther King and say, you know what, I can get on board with that. And if the Malcolm X people won't allow me to just drop this issue and let it slide under the radar, then I'll join Martin Luther King. Like, I'm convinced that might, in some cases, possibly be necessary. So I don't know that you can have change without some version of power. And yeah, and I think if I'm thinking about my own reactions to anti-woke and social justice tribes, oftentimes I do think these groups should be working in tandem. They should be complementing each other. I think that the social justice people, I think they're pretty good at thinking about systemic issues, which are really, really important. And the group that I'm calling anti-woke, and I acknowledge that's a little bit derogatory too, and I don't mean to be. I think that group is really good at liberal values and justice, a certain type of justice. So like those groups working together, I think is what I'm hoping to see. And it irks me that they're oftentimes at odds with each other, whereas there is a way more productive conversation to happen. So yeah, this is just my critique of the book, but overall I think it's wonderful book. I really appreciate its contribution, and it has a lot of great things to say despite my critiques.